The acrid smell of burning plastic and tear gas stung Marcus Thompson's nostrils as he pressed his face against the convention center's reinforced glass windows. Outside, police sirens wailed through the chaos, while protesters hurled bottles at riot shields, their chants of "Justice for TechFlow" echoing off the concrete walls like battle cries. Orange flames licked the sides of overturned vehicles, casting hellish shadows across the faces of fleeing investors who clutched their briefcases and ran toward waiting limousines. "Sir, we need to evacuate now," shouted Detective Sarah Mills, her badge gleaming under the emergency lighting as she grabbed Marcus by the arm. Behind her, SWAT officers in full tactical gear swept through the building, their weapons drawn, their faces hidden behind black masks that made them look more like invaders than protectors. Marcus yanked his arm free, his dark eyes blazing with a fury that had been building for the past 6 hours. "I'm not leaving. This is my company, my product launch, my life's work burning out there because some racist woman decided to weaponize 911 against us." The detective's grip tightened. "Mr. Thompson, there are credible threats against your life. Karen Whitmore's allegations triggered a federal terrorism investigation. Until we sort this out—" "Sort this out?" Marcus's voice cracked like a whip. "My servers are being seized. My employees are in handcuffs. And my reputation is destroyed because Karen couldn't handle losing a government contract to a black-owned business. There's nothing to sort out except her lies." 6 hours earlier, the Marriott Convention Center had buzzed with anticipation. TechFlow's revolutionary cybersecurity platform was about to launch publicly after 3 years of development, promising to protect small businesses from digital threats at a fraction of traditional costs. Marcus had poured his MIT education, his Silicon Valley experience, and every dollar he'd inherited from his grandmother into this moment. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the future of cybersecurity," Marcus had announced from the polished stage, his navy suit impeccable, his smile confident as cameras flashed and investors leaned forward in their seats. The demo had gone perfectly. The app's interface was sleek, intuitive, revolutionary. Tech journalists scribbled notes furiously, while venture capitalists calculated potential returns on their phones. In the back row, Karen Whitmore sat with her arms crossed, her blonde hair pulled into a severe bun, her pale face twisted with barely concealed rage. As CEO of CyberShield Solutions, she'd lost the Department of Homeland Security contract to TechFlow just 2 weeks ago. The government had chosen Marcus's innovative approach over her company's outdated systems, and the decision had cost her firm millions in projected revenue. "The audacity," she muttered to her assistant, Linda, who shifted uncomfortably beside her. 3 years in business, and he thinks he can waltz in and steal contracts from established companies. We've been protecting government systems since before he learned to code. Linda glanced nervously at the stage where Marcus was explaining how TechFlow's AI algorithms could detect threats in real time. "But his technology is genuinely innovative. Karen, maybe we should focus on improving our own—" "Don't you dare suggest we're inferior to that startup." Karen's voice was ice cold, her manicured nails digging into her palms. "I built CyberShield from nothing. I'm not about to let some diversity hire with government connections destroy everything I've worked for." The racial slur hung in the air between them like poison. Linda recoiled, her face flushing with embarrassment and shame. She'd worked for Karen for 5 years, but this was the first time her boss had revealed the true depth of her prejudice so openly. As Marcus concluded his presentation to thunderous applause, Karen pulled out her phone with trembling fingers. Her mind raced through possibilities, through scenarios, through ways to destroy what she couldn't control. Then, inspiration struck dark, twisted, but potentially effective. She dialed 911 with the practiced calm of someone making a routine business call. 911. What's your emergency? This is Karen Whitmore, CEO of CyberShield Solutions. I'm at the Marriott Convention Center, and I need to report a credible terrorist threat. Her voice was steady, authoritative, the voice of a concerned citizen doing her civic duty. Ma'am, can you describe the nature of the threat? Karen's eyes fixed on Marcus as he shook hands with potential investors, his face glowing with pride and accomplishment. There's a technology demonstration happening here that appears to be a cover for cyber terrorism activities. The company is called TechFlow, and their software has capabilities that could be used to infiltrate government systems. I have reason to believe they're connected to foreign adversaries seeking to compromise national security. The lies flowed from her lips like water, each fabrication more elaborate than the last. She claimed to have insider knowledge of suspicious communications, of encrypted messages between TechFlow employees and unknown overseas contacts, of software backdoors designed to steal classified information. Are you in immediate danger, ma'am? I believe so. They're demonstrating their capabilities to a room full of potential targets, including government contractors and defense industry representatives. This could be reconnaissance for a larger attack. Within minutes, the first police cars arrived with sirens blazing. Security guards at the convention center looked confused as officers demanded access to the building. Marcus was in the middle of answering questions from a reporter when Detective Mills approached him, her expression grim. Mr. Thompson, I need you to step away from the crowd. We've received reports of suspicious activity related to your company. Marcus laughed, thinking it was some kind of mistake. Suspicious activity, Detective. We're launching a cybersecurity platform. The only suspicious thing here is how effectively we're going to protect small businesses from hackers. Sir, we have credible information suggesting your software may be designed for malicious purposes. I need you to cooperate while we investigate these allegations. The blood drained from Marcus's face as the reality of the situation hit him. Around the room, investors began looking at their phones, their expressions shifting from interest to concern as news alerts started popping up. Social media was already buzzing with reports of a terrorist investigation at the TechFlow launch. This is insane, Marcus said, his voice rising. Who made these allegations? What evidence do you have? That information is part of an ongoing investigation. For now, I need you to remain calm while we secure the premises. But calm was impossible as SWAT teams stormed through the building, as terrified investors fled toward the exits, as news helicopters circled overhead like vultures. Marcus watched his dream crumble in real time. His employees herded into one corner of the room while officers confiscated laptops, phones, and presentation materials. Dr. Amara Okafor, TechFlow's chief technology officer, stood defiant, even as officers zip-tied her hands behind her back. This is racial profiling disguised as national security, she shouted, her Nigerian accent thick with indignation. Marcus Thompson is a patriot who served this country in the army before building this company. How dare you treat us like criminals? Her words cut through the chaos, but they only seemed to make things worse. Outside, protesters had begun gathering as word of the arrests spread through social media. The hashtag #TechFlowFrameUp started trending within hours, alongside Justice for Marcus and cyber racism. Karen watched the mayhem unfold from her rental car across the street, her hands steady on the steering wheel despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Linda sat beside her in stunned silence, occasionally glancing at her boss as if seeing her for the first time. You did this, Linda whispered, her voice barely audible over the sirens. You called in a fake terrorism report. I reported suspicious activity, Karen corrected smoothly. It's not my fault if law enforcement took those concerns seriously. Maybe if TechFlow had been more transparent about their overseas connections, this wouldn't have happened. What overseas connections Marcus is from Detroit? His parents are teachers. His grandmother owned a bakery in Corktown. Karen's jaw tightened. Everyone has connections these days. Linda, in my business, you learn to look beyond the surface. But, even as she spoke, doubt gnawed at her. The SWAT response had been more intense than she'd anticipated. What she'd intended as a minor disruption was spiraling into a national incident. Her phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters, from competitors, from government contacts wanting to know what she knew about TechFlow's terrorist connections. By evening, the story had exploded across every major news network. Cable news anchors speculated about the implications of a cybersecurity startup being investigated for terrorism. Stock markets had already begun reacting, with tech companies losing billions in value as investors worried about the security of their own systems. The arrest of TechFlow executives raises serious questions about the vetting process for government contractors, announced CNN's primetime host. How did a company with alleged terrorist connections get so close to classified systems? On Fox News, the narrative was even more inflammatory. Sources suggest that foreign adversaries may have infiltrated the American tech industry through companies like TechFlow, using diversity initiatives as cover for espionage operations. Marcus sat in a holding cell, his expensive suit wrinkled and stained, his mind racing through the legal and financial implications of what was happening. His lawyer, Rebecca Chen, had arrived within hours, her briefcase bulging with documents and her phone buzzing with calls from journalists. The good news is that they don't have any real evidence, Rebecca told him during their first meeting in the cramped interview room. The bad news is that the allegations alone have done tremendous damage to your company's reputation and stock value. How is this possible? Marcus asked, running his hands through his hair. I served my country. I've never even had a parking ticket. My software is designed to protect people, not harm them. Someone wanted to destroy you, Rebecca said bluntly. The question is, who and why? The FBI is treating this as a credible terrorism investigation, which means they received specific, detailed information from someone with apparent insider knowledge. As Rebecca spoke, FBI cybersecurity experts were conducting a thorough audit of TechFlow's systems, looking for the malicious code and backdoors that Karen had described in her call. They found nothing suspicious. The software was exactly what Marcus claimed it to be, an innovative, legitimate cybersecurity platform with no hidden functions or unauthorized connections. But the absence of evidence didn't stop the speculation. Rival tech companies, sensing an opportunity, began reaching out to TechFlow's potential clients, suggesting that they switch to more trustworthy alternatives. CyberShield Solutions saw a massive surge in inquiries from government contractors who were suddenly skeptical of newer, less established firms. Karen worked late into the night, fielding calls from potential clients and carefully positioning herself as a voice of reason in the chaos. This tragic situation with TechFlow shows why experience matters in cybersecurity, she told a Pentagon procurement officer who had called seeking alternatives. At CyberShield, we've been protecting sensitive systems for over a decade. We understand the importance of rigorous security protocols and thorough background checks. Her profits soared as fear drove clients toward established companies. The Department of Homeland Security quietly reached out about reinstating CyberShield's contract, citing concerns about the reliability of newer vendors. Karen felt vindicated, triumphant even, as she watched her stock price climb while tech flows fell into free fall. But her victory was short-lived. FBI Special Agent David Rodriguez, a seasoned investigator with 20 years of experience in cybercrime, was growing increasingly suspicious of the case against TechFlow. The company's technology was clean, their employees were cleared for security work, and their financial records showed no suspicious transactions or overseas connections. "Something doesn't add up," Rodriguez told his partner, Agent Jennifer Walsh, as they reviewed the evidence for the third time. The initial report was incredibly detailed, but none of the specific claims check out. Either we're dealing with the most sophisticated terrorist operation in history, or someone fed us false information. Agent Walsh nodded grimly. "I've been thinking the same thing." The caller seemed to know an awful lot about TechFlow's internal operations for someone who's supposedly just a concerned citizen. Maybe we should take a closer look at Karen Whitmore. The investigation into Karen began quietly, with agents reviewing her phone records, financial transactions, and business relationships. What they found was a pattern of increasingly desperate attempts to maintain market share in the face of innovative competitors. CyberShield had lost 3 major contracts in the past year, all to companies with more advanced technology or better pricing. But the real breakthrough came when Rodriguez's team examined Karen's digital communications. Like many executives, she'd been careless with her cybersecurity, using weak passwords and ignoring software updates. The irony wasn't lost on Rodriguez. The CEO of a cybersecurity company had left herself vulnerable to exactly the kind of attack her own products were supposed to prevent. Hidden in Karen's email system, the agents found something extraordinary, a series of forged communications designed to look like correspondence between TechFlow employees and foreign contacts. The fake emails discussed everything from classified information to coordinated cyber attacks, creating a paper trail of evidence that would have been devastating if it had been real. "She's been manufacturing evidence," Rodriguez told his supervisor, FBI Director Patricia Hayes, during an emergency briefing. Whitmore hacked into TechFlow's email system and created fake communications to support her terrorism allegations. This isn't just false reporting. It's a sophisticated disinformation campaign designed to destroy a competitor. Director Hayes leaned back in her chair, her expression grave. "How confident are you in this assessment?" 100%. We have digital forensics evidence showing that the fake emails were created from Whitmore's personal laptop using sophisticated spoofing software. She even researched foreign IP addresses to make the communications look authentic. This was premeditated corporate sabotage disguised as national security concerns. The revelation sent shockwaves through the FBI and beyond. A terrorism investigation that had consumed federal resources, triggered nationwide protests, and caused billions in market losses had been based on fabricated evidence created by a jealous competitor. The implications were staggering. Within hours of the FBI's discovery, news of Karen's deception began leaking to the press. Social media exploded with outrage as the full scope of her manipulation became clear. The hashtag #KarenLied began trending alongside calls for her arrest and prosecution. Marcus was released from custody as the charges against him were quietly dropped. But the damage to his company was severe. TechFlow's stock had lost 70% of its value. Several key employees had resigned under pressure, and potential clients had fled to competitors. Standing outside the FBI building in Detroit, Marcus faced a crowd of reporters with Rebecca at his side. "The truth is finally coming out," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion etched on his face. "For the past week, my family and I have lived through a nightmare, orchestrated by someone who couldn't compete in the marketplace. So she tried to destroy us through lies and deception. A reporter shouted from the crowd, "Mr. Thompson, do you plan to sue Karen Whitmore and CyberShield Solutions?" "We're exploring all legal options," Rebecca answered before Marcus could respond. What happened here wasn't just corporate sabotage. It was an attack on the principles of fair competition and due process. Ms. Whitmore weaponized the justice system against an innocent company, and there must be consequences. But even as Marcus spoke about justice and accountability, Karen was frantically trying to control the narrative from her executive office at CyberShield. Her legal team had informed her that federal charges were likely, and her board of directors was demanding her resignation. The carefully constructed empire she'd built over 15 years was crumbling in real time. "This is a witch hunt," Karen told her lawyer, Jonathan Steele, as he reviewed the FBI's evidence against her. "I reported legitimate security concerns about a competitor. If the government overreacted, that's not my fault." Steele shook his head grimly. "Karen, they have digital forensics evidence showing that you created fake emails and planted them in TechFlow's system. This isn't about reporting security concerns. This is about fraud, computer intrusion, and false reporting of terrorist activities. You're looking at decades in federal prison." The reality of her situation finally hit Karen like a physical blow. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, scrolling through news articles that painted her as a racist corporate saboteur who had nearly destroyed an innocent company out of jealousy and prejudice. Her reputation, her business, her freedom, everything was slipping away. The breaking point came when Senator Elizabeth Warren announced that the Senate Judiciary Committee would hold hearings on the TechFlow incident, focusing on how false terrorism reports could be weaponized against minority-owned businesses. The hearings, scheduled for the following month, would examine the broader implications of Karen's actions for national security and corporate accountability. This case represents a disturbing trend of using law enforcement as a weapon against legitimate businesses. Senator Warren announced at a press conference, "We need to understand how someone like Karen Whitmore was able to manipulate federal agencies into targeting an innocent company, and we need to implement safeguards to prevent this from happening again." The announcement sent shockwaves through the tech industry. Major investors who had initially fled from TechFlow began reconsidering their positions as the company's innocence became clear. Venture capital firms started reaching out to Marcus, offering not just funding, but partnerships that would help rebuild his damaged reputation. At the same time, CyberShield's clients began abandoning the company in droves. Government contractors who had initially praised Karen's warnings about TechFlow now saw her as a liability who could potentially drag them into legal proceedings. The Department of Homeland Security quietly canceled their contract negotiations, citing concerns about CyberShield's ethical standards and business practices. The Senate hearings, when they finally convened, were a media spectacle unlike anything the tech industry had ever witnessed. The committee room was packed with reporters, protesters, and industry representatives, all eager to hear testimony about one of the most damaging cases of corporate sabotage in recent memory. Marcus testified first, his voice strong and clear as he described the nightmare his company had endured. "Senators, what happened to TechFlow wasn't just an attack on my business. It was an attack on the American dream itself. We built innovative technology to protect people, and we were nearly destroyed by someone who couldn't compete honestly in the marketplace." Dr. Okafor followed, her testimony even more powerful as she described the racism and xenophobia that had amplified Karen's false allegations. "I came to America because I believed it was a place where talent and hard work mattered more than the color of your skin or the accent in your voice. What Karen Whitmore did reminded me that some people still see my success as a threat to their privilege. When Karen finally took the witness stand, flanked by 3 lawyers and looking pale and drawn, the committee room fell silent. Senator Warren leaned forward, her expression stern as she began her questioning. Ms. Whitmore, did you knowingly provide false information to federal law enforcement agencies about TechFlow's activities? Karen's voice was barely a whisper. I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Did you hack into TechFlow's computer systems to plant fabricated evidence? I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. The pattern continued for 20 minutes, with Karen refusing to answer any substantive questions about her actions. Her silence spoke louder than any admission of guilt, and the committee members made their feelings clear through increasingly pointed questions about corporate responsibility and ethical standards. Senator Ted Cruz, despite his conservative credentials, was particularly harsh in his criticism. Ms. Whitmore, you've heard testimony today about the devastating impact your actions had on an American company and its employees. Do you feel any remorse for the damage you've caused to these people's lives and careers? Karen looked up for the first time during her testimony, her eyes meeting Cruz's across the committee table. For a moment, it seemed like she might break her silence, might finally acknowledge the pain she'd caused. But then, her lawyer whispered something in her ear, and she returned to her prepared statement. I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. The hearings concluded with a bipartisan call for federal legislation to prevent the weaponization of terrorism reports against legitimate businesses. Both parties agreed that Karen's actions represented a clear abuse of the system, and that stronger penalties were needed for false reporting of terrorist activities. But legislation was cold comfort for the real victims of Karen's scheme. TechFlow, despite being vindicated, faced months of rebuilding trust with clients and investors. Several employees had suffered nervous breakdowns during the investigation, and Marcus himself had aged years in the span of weeks. The company's recovery began slowly, with a handful of brave investors who saw opportunity in the chaos. TechFlow's technology was still revolutionary, and the public sympathy generated by their ordeal had actually increased brand recognition in some circles. Marcus found himself invited to speak at conferences about resilience and innovation in the face of adversity. We survived because we had something Karen couldn't fabricate, Marcus told a gathering of entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley 6 months after his release. We had the truth, and we had each other. When everything else was stripped away, our reputation, our clients, our freedom, we still had the knowledge that we were building something good for the world. The legal consequences for Karen came swiftly once the Senate hearings concluded. Federal prosecutors, armed with overwhelming evidence and public pressure, filed charges of computer fraud, false reporting of terrorist activities, and conspiracy to commit economic espionage. The charges carried a potential sentence of 40 years in federal prison. CyberShield Solutions collapsed within weeks of Karen's indictment. Clients fled, investors pulled funding, and key employees resigned to join competitors. The company that Karen had spent 15 years building was liquidated to pay legal fees and civil settlements. Her personal assets, the mansion in Bloomfield Hills, the vacation home in the Hamptons, the luxury cars were all seized to cover the massive damages claimed by TechFlow and other affected parties. The civil lawsuit alone was staggering. TechFlow's attorneys calculated that Karen's actions had cost the company over $200 million in lost revenue, market capitalization, and reputation damage. Additional claims from employees, investors, and business partners pushed the total liability well over $500 million. Karen's fall from grace was complete and public. The woman who had once commanded respect in corporate boardrooms now faced photographers and protesters every time she appeared in court. Her legal team struggled to find any defense for actions that seemed indefensible in light of the evidence. The plea negotiations were brief and brutal. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of decades in prison, Karen agreed to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a sentence of 12 years in federal prison. She also agreed to pay full restitution to TechFlow and to cooperate with ongoing investigations into similar cases of corporate sabotage. At her sentencing hearing, Karen finally broke her months of silence. Standing before Judge Margaret Harrison in Detroit's federal courthouse, she offered her first public apology for the chaos she had caused. "Your Honor, I take full responsibility for my actions," Karen said, her voice steady but small in the packed courtroom. "I let jealousy and fear drive me to do terrible things to innocent people. I destroyed lives, damaged trust in our institutions, and betrayed everything I claim to stand for as a businesswoman." She turned toward the section where Marcus and his employees sat, her eyes meeting his for the first time since the nightmare began. "Mr. Thompson, I know my apology can't undo the pain I've caused you and your team, but I want you to know that I recognize how wrong I was, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends for what I did." Marcus listened to her words with a mixture of anger and pity. Part of him wanted to reject her apology, to remind her of the employees who had suffered panic attacks, of the investors who had lost faith in American innovation, of the damage she had done to trust between law enforcement and minority communities. But another part of him, the part that had been shaped by his grandmother's teachings about forgiveness and redemption, recognized a broken woman who had finally acknowledged her mistakes. Judge Harrison was less forgiving in her remarks. "Ms. Whitmore, your actions represent one of the most destructive cases of corporate sabotage this court has ever seen. You didn't just attack a competitor. You attacked the very foundations of fair competition and due process that make our economy possible. The sentence I'm imposing today reflects the seriousness of your crimes and the need to deter others who might consider similar actions." The 12-year sentence was exactly what prosecutors had recommended, and Karen accepted it without visible emotion. As marshals led her away in handcuffs, she looked back once more at Marcus, who nodded slightly in what might have been acknowledgement, if not forgiveness. The aftermath of Karen's conviction rippled through the tech industry for years. TechFlow not only recovered, but thrived, with their story of resilience inspiring other minority-owned businesses to persevere through challenges. Marcus became a sought-after speaker on corporate ethics and fair competition, using his platform to advocate for stronger protections against economic sabotage. Dr. Okafor founded a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting minority entrepreneurs who faced discrimination or sabotage, funded in part by the restitution payments from Karen's case. "We can't prevent all the Karens in the world," she told a conference of African entrepreneurs, "but we can make sure their victims have the resources and support they need to fight back and rebuild." The legislation sparked by the Senate hearings became law within 18 months, creating new federal crimes for the malicious filing of false terrorism reports and establishing stronger penalties for corporate sabotage. The TechFlow Act, as it became known, also created a fund to compensate businesses damaged by false allegations, funded by fines collected from convicted saboteurs. 5 years after Karen's conviction, TechFlow had grown into one of the most successful cybersecurity companies in the world, with offices in 12 countries and contracts with major corporations and government agencies. Marcus often reflected on the strange path that had led him to success, how an act of pure malice had ultimately made his company stronger and more resilient. During a company retreat in Colorado, Marcus addressed his employees about the lessons they had learned from their ordeal. Karen Whitmore tried to destroy us with lies and hatred. But she ended up proving something more powerful, that truth and integrity will always triumph over deception and prejudice. We're not just stronger because we survived her attack. We're better because we learned to trust each other completely when everything else was uncertain. The audience, which included many of the original employees who had endured arrest and interrogation, erupted in applause. Dr. Okafor wiped tears from her eyes as she remembered the fear and anger of those dark weeks, and how they had ultimately forged bonds stronger than any corporate team-building exercise could create. In her federal prison cell in Coleman, Florida, Karen read about TechFlow's continued success in the business magazines that other inmates left behind. She had served 3 years of her sentence and would be eligible for parole in 6 more. The woman who had once commanded a corporate empire now worked in the prison laundry for 23 cents an hour. Her days filled with reflection on the choices that had brought her to this place. She had lost everything: her company, her wealth, her reputation, her freedom in pursuit of a competition that had never really existed except in her own mind. Marcus Thompson had never been her enemy. He had simply been a better entrepreneur with better technology. The real enemy had been her own jealousy, her own prejudices, her own inability to accept that success could come from unexpected places. The letter she wrote to Marcus and his team, expressing remorse and asking for forgiveness, went unanswered. She understood why. Some wounds were too deep for easy healing, and some betrayals too profound for simple apologies. But she kept writing them anyway. Not because she expected responses, but because taking responsibility was the only path toward redemption she could see. On a warm spring morning in Detroit, Marcus stood in the gleaming lobby of TechFlow's new headquarters, watching employees stream in for another day of innovation and growth. The building was a monument not just to their success, but to their survival. A testament to the power of truth over deception and community over individual ambition. His phone buzzed with a news alert about another false terrorism report filed against a minority-owned business in California. The victim, a solar energy startup, had immediately hired lawyers familiar with the TechFlow case and had begun documenting evidence of corporate sabotage. The perpetrator would likely face charges under the TechFlow Act, and justice would be swifter and more certain thanks to the precedent Karen's case had established. Marcus smiled grimly as he read the article. Karen Whitmore's legacy would live on, not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of competition, but as proof that no one, no matter how powerful or established, could weaponize hatred against innovation and expect to win. The system had been tested, had been wounded, but had ultimately held firm in defense of truth and fairness. The protesters who had once filled the streets demanding justice for TechFlow had long since moved on to other causes. But their voices had been heard. The investors who had fled in panic had returned with deeper pockets and stronger commitments. The employees who had endured arrest and interrogation had stayed loyal and been rewarded with stock options that made them wealthy beyond their dreams. And somewhere in a federal prison, a woman who had once believed that success was a zero-sum game was learning the hardest lesson of all that in trying to destroy others. She had only succeeded in destroying herself. The tech industry, meanwhile, had emerged stronger, more vigilant, and more committed to the principles of fair competition that made innovation possible. As Marcus walked toward the elevator that would take him to his office on the 30th floor, he thought about his grandmother's words from so many years ago. "Baby, some people will try to tear you down because they can't build themselves up. But remember, their hate can't touch what you build with love, truth, and hard work." She had been right, as she always was. The building around him, the company bearing his name, the employees whose lives had been changed for the better, all of it stood as proof that innovation and integrity would always triumph over jealousy and deception. The future stretched ahead of them, bright with possibility and strengthened by the knowledge that they had faced their worst enemy and emerged victorious. Karen Whitmore had tried to end their story with a lie, but instead, she had given them the greatest gift of all, the unshakable certainty that they could overcome anything together.